Let's get started with our next talk by Don Cooper. Stop the Bulldozers, Hardening the AWS CDK Deployment Process. Just a quick shout out to our sponsor, Trust on Cloud. Trust on Cloud provides the best in-depth threat models available for cloud services by using a risk-based library of easy-to-understand and contextual controls. Our customers have been able to adopt cloud services 70% faster and with greater confidence. Our subscription service helps move you from point-in-time risk assessments of your cloud services to a continuous assessment. Just a reminder, we'll be taking questions from the room and then on Slack as well. And then after this talk, the food truck should be ready to serve. With that said, go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm hoping that you can all hear me down the back. I am Dawn Cooper, and I do this a lot. Sometimes it starts when someone comes up to me at a user group and says, "You use a walking stick. Will you come and talk to my coding bootcamp students about web accessibility?" That one was a shtick for a while. This time it starts with a question, specifically why. I've said that multiple times during this process. I now hope to enumerate exactly how that goes. Now, much as this is a cloud security conference, I promise that if you scan the QR code that is currently up on the screen here, it is not going to take you to some nefarious hacking website. I'm not that cruel. It will just take you to a GitHub repo, which has basically the code that I have put together as I have poked holes through the AWS CDK bootstrap process. So this story starts when I get put on a client which uses AWS CDK, and they say to me, all right, we want to deploy this new library. We want your help with that. And the AWS CDK, for those who are not aware, is basically infrastructure as code, but with programming languages. The difficulty with that is that AWS is not really designed for that, which means that if you want to run AWS CDK code in your accounts, one of the intermediate steps for that is converting it to CloudFormation, which means that you need to be able to run some sort of a bootstrapping process which will allow you to do that. The bootstrapping process in question, when I first looked at this in 2022, and I'm hoping that everyone can actually see the text here, was enumerated by a CloudFormation template that looks something like this. Now, AWS have actually changed a few things about this template since I started looking at it. But the fact remains that the version of the template which was deployed in 2022 had some pretty interesting security holes that I discovered as I started poking around it. To start with, if we go down here and we have a look at this qualifier, if you want to deploy more than one CDK stack at a time, you need to change the qualifier. Say if you want to configure multiple sets of deployments, you need to change the qualifier for the CDK stack, which means that by default and in a lot of scenarios, what people who don't necessarily understand this are going to do is they're going to go and deploy one version of this and then they will take it from there. Now, I caveat what I'm saying here by most of the things that I'm talking about here are documented. Pretty much all of the things that I'm talking about here that are not documented are things that could be enumerated if you poke at this a little bit. I am not a security researcher. I'm a cloud platform person who dabbles in this. But that qualifier was the first pointer to me to some of the problems that you can potentially end up with when you're deploying CDK bootstrap stacks, because if we scroll down all the way to the bottom here, you've got a bunch of roles, and I should have actually closed this out, but the one that we care about for the purposes of this, well, the two that we care about for the purposes of this are the deployment action role and the CloudFormation execution role. Why are there two roles? There you go, there's that question. There's the why. Well, the trick with this is that in version 1 of the CDK bootstrapping stack, CDK took the permissions of the person who was deploying, basically the person, entity, role, what have you, that was deploying the CDK stack and used those when it was making the deployments. This change, the addition of the deployment action role and CloudFormation execution role in the CDK bootstrapping stack version 2, was done for the purposes of allowing cross-account CDK deployments. Hold that thought. We're going to get back to that one. So the way that this fundamentally works is someone wants to do something, they assume into the deployment action role. Or you run a CDK deploy, that assumes into the deployment action role. That's where permissions for who can actually assume into the role are handled. That then goes and assumes the CloudFormation execution role, which, if you don't enumerate specific execution policies that you want it to run, will go and deploy everything with administrator access. There's problem 1. Now, AWS have improved this in the sense that now you can, this has always been enumerated in their documentation, and they've improved this in the sense that, as well as CloudFormation execution policies, you can now also add permissions boundaries to this, so you can stop people from creating things like IAM roles, which are vastly more privileged than what people currently, than their standard permissions. But the permissions boundary change was only made at the beginning of 2023, which means that there are a bunch of these CDK bootstrap stacks still sitting around which don't actually have that as something that you get standard out of the box. Which becomes more interesting when we go and look at the 2023 version of this. These 2 parameters here, trusted accounts for lookup. This is the reason why the CDK Bootstrap Stack v2 changed the way that it used roles and permissions from CDK Bootstrap Stack v1. It's to allow that scenario where you want to deploy things across accounts. And you can do this in CloudFormation. You've been able to do it for forever. It's called stack sets. The trick, though, is that when you do this in CDK, there are a few guardrails that you've got present in CloudFormation which are kind of missing. So if you do this in CloudFormation, you want to deploy stack sets, you do that from generally your organization root account. Or you can delegate permission out to deploy stack sets. But that is managed by the controlling account. The CDK bootstrap process is managed by the controlled account. So in the account where you deploy the CDK bootstrap stack, you go and set up a list of trusted accounts and trusted accounts for lookup, that being the read-only version, that you want to allow to deploy things into that account. With apologies to Nathan earlier for the AWS account name, this is a perfectly standalone AWS account which I spun up less than 24 hours ago. There is absolutely nothing in it. It has one user, one IAM user with a set of access keys. Completely clean, absolutely blank AWS account. Separately, I have an AWS organization, which I was using for testing. When I decided to put the account ID of this account into that template and deploy it to every account in my AWS organization, and then run a CDK deploy command, stack user initiated, this bucket really should not be here, create in progress, create complete. Deployment time, 39.88 seconds. You'll note down the bottom there the user ID of hacker, this being clearly a standalone IAM user. And now, if I go and have a look at the AWS account in my organization, sure enough, this bucket really should not be here. Now, is everybody going to be able to exploit this particular flaw in the AWS CDK bootstrap process? No, because you need access to the controlled account to do it. The 2 scenarios that I can see where this can end up becoming a problem are insider threats, and if someone is already in your accounts and they're trying to work out ways to get permissions to do more things, or they are trying to, in the infamous Cloud Spaces case from about 2014, they're trying to add more backdoors into the system so that as you lock them out, they've got other ways in. The thing is, though, CloudFormation kind of protects you from this. CDK doesn't. So, that being said, when we're looking at how to lock down some of the issues with these CDK templates, what can we do? To deal with this one, in practice, essentially nothing. It's just something that you have to be aware of and set up guardrails to try to stop it from happening or make sure that you will be notified if those permissions are being put in to accounts outside your organization. Things that we can do, though. Over here, if you want to deploy multiple CDK stacks into one account, all that you have to do is that qualifier that we saw earlier. You just need to change it to a basically 10-character string. Scenarios where you might want to do this, if you want to set up CDK stacks with different permissions, so have one CDK stack which is used by developers, one CDK stack which is used by people who are testing infrastructure, one CDK stack which is used to deploy to production, which maybe your CI/CD only has access to. This allows you then to scope down what you want to do with the CDK stacks depending on the particular situation. As far as the scoping itself goes, if you deploy this CDK bootstrap stack on the command line, you can basically give it a list of trusted accounts, a list of CloudFormation execution policies. You can also just take this bootstrap template and modify it, as you see here. I've added read-only access as a default CloudFormation execution policy. That means that your administrator access problem goes away. It really is that trivial. But in saying that, by default, the bootstrap stack only allows you to use AWS managed policies for this. And that means that you're potentially going to be either attaching a lot of them, or you're going to find yourself running into situations where you don't quite have the access that you need to be able to perform particular tasks. The way that you can deal with this then, if I bring up the custom version here, you can essentially just slap a deployment policy onto the bootstrap. If you deploy this via YAML, you can essentially just slap a deployment policy onto the version of this that you're using for bootstrapping. The good thing about this is it allows you to do whatever the hell you want. The disadvantage of this is that if you want to then enumerate a number of CDK stacks for different tasks, you have to actually manage all of those in YAML. The other really big problem with the CDK bootstrap stack deployment process is it doesn't give you a simple means by default to lock down the set of people or entities who can access an account, who can access a stack, other than by account. That trusted accounts and trusted accounts for lookup that you get by default out of this template, that's it. That's the only way that you can do this. So if you really want to harden this, then what you would be looking at, if I remember what I called it, here we go. There's a section in the policy document itself where you get an assume role. And by default, that's going to pull the list of accounts from the trusted accounts. If you want to lock that down, what it becomes is a matter of, rather than just taking trusted accounts, you specify yourself a principle that you want to use. So this one, in this instance, is from the AWS account, we're looking for a role called platform infrastructure. This is where the real power is. Again, you've still got to maintain this in YAML, but you can do this with roles. You can do it with pretty much any entity around. You can even do it with OIDC. Although I do recommend that if you're using GitHub Actions for your OIDC, you go and check out the talk from yesterday about exploits on GitHub Actions, because I realize in hindsight, if you're using GitHub Actions and CDK, the bulldozers that you can drive through this just get way, way bigger. Again, AWS has documented the vast majority of this. And the aspects of it that they haven't documented are discoverable without that much understanding of security and without that much knowledge of the things that you might need to poke around. But that also relies on having people who understand how cloud infrastructure works in your teams. And to my mind, this is kind of where the biggest bulldozer is. And this is why coming to a cloud security conference, this is worth talking about, because it's not necessarily people like me who do your platform infrastructure that you need to worry about in this scenario. It's, if you're a consultant, it's the clients where you've got devs managing their own infrastructure. There is a good chance that if organizations are using AWS CDK, they are doing this because they want devs to have some degree of management beyond just having a platform infrastructure team produce everything with CDK and roll it out for them. The advantage of that, the advantage of CDK as a whole, is it is really easy for devs to understand compared to making them go away and write all their own YAML like these CloudFormation templates. The disadvantage of AWS CDK is it is really easy for devs to understand, which makes it really, really easy for them to shoot themselves in the foot when you end up with unintended behavior, like everything being given administrator access by default. Again, AWS will warn you of this. What happens when the people who are playing around with this don't understand that warning? So, takeaways. If you're going to deal with bleeding edge things like AWS CDK, have a think about what you're poking at. Understand what you're trying to do. As I was fully realizing the scope of this in my hotel room this morning, making sure that I could give this talk without a reliable Wi-Fi connection, I'm fairly sure that at one point I looked at my Wi-Fi, was just like, why would anyone, why is it that every time we come up with these great innovations which are supposed to make people's lives easier, the end result is stuff like this, where you've got people like me who aren't even security researchers poking holes in it. Make sure that you think about unintended attack vectors, scenarios where you might need to lock down permissions like this, because there are things that CDK will surface for you. Even if you get administrator access by default, CDK will tell you about that. It's not going to tell you about the fact that locking things down by accounts isn't necessarily the most secure way of doing it. And please, 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 whenever you end up in scenarios like this, set up things like config rules, validation, so that if someone decides to use the CDK bootstrap stack as a means for a privilege escalation attack, you've got some sort of alerting which is going to tell you about it before the bulldozers knock over your company. And that is that.
Any questions in the room? I guess I'm not a CDK expert by any means, but from an AWS perspective, if you were to become the head of the CDK team for a day, what changes would you make?
That's a really hard one, because much as I'm kind of ragging on CDK here, they do, these trade-offs have all been made for understandable reasons. It's just, this is a tool which is being used by the sorts of people that these trade-offs are most likely to screw over. I'd probably have to actually go away and think about that, because by no means am I a security researcher. I think the biggest thing which comes immediately to mind is sit down, rewrite the documentation. The warnings that are there, but they're not sufficient. Make sure that the first thing that people see when they go to pages explaining the CDK bootstrap stack is how you can shoot yourself in the foot with this. Because there is a great big warning there about the administrator access, but there aren't necessarily warnings there about everything else. And if you've got devs managing your infrastructure, they're not gonna have any idea about the privilege escalation issues that particularly that cross-account piece might lead to.
All right. Any other questions? Cool. Thank you again. We will be back at 11:30, so in 10 minutes with Unmasking the Subnet, Lookalike IP Ranges in Cloud Environments by Asaf. Thank you.